Welcome to the podcast of Ideas. I'm Alistair Donald, Associate Director at Academy of Ideas. It's been a week of mounting confusion and no little outrage since the award-winning Telegraph journalist Allison Pearson received a visit from the police telling her she was under investigation for stirring up racial hatred. Yesterday, she was informed that no charges would be brought, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Luke Gittos, solicitor and a solicitor that's been helping the Free Speech Union with the defence of Alison against the charges that have been brought. So welcome, Luke. It's nice to have you on the show.
Thanks, Alistair. Good to be here.
So the police turn up at 9:30 at Alison Pearson's door on Remembrance Sunday. Can you just tell us a bit about the circumstances and what happened initially when they turned up?
Yeah, so officers arrived at Miss Pearson's address and said they wanted to arrange an interview with her in connection with an incident. It then became reported that she was under investigation for a non-crime hate incident. But in fact, the Essex police then clarified that this was an allegation into a criminal offence of stirring up racial hatred. And I think some of the confusion was initially generated from the use by the officers of that term incident. This was an investigation into a crime of stirring up racial hatred, which, in my view, never should have begun. Alison Pearson was never told on the day precisely what was being alleged, and really it never got any clearer before the case was over. And so we know that an investigation was started, meaning that they felt under an obligation to look into the circumstances of a particular tweet from over a year ago. And we know that that investigation has now concluded without them needing to interview. And even that shows you that I think the officers involved and even the senior investigating officers at Essex Police were very aware of the public outcry that had arisen from this case. I think they themselves felt perhaps uncomfortable with the level of scrutiny that their decision making had suddenly been subject to. And I think it also shows that sometimes the police operate as though arriving at someone's door and asking to speak to them about a crime is not that big a deal or something that we should all just put up with. And really, the great thing about this case is I think that there is, to some extent, been a line in the sand drawn around this, where people have actually made a fuss, largely thanks to the Telegraph newspaper and their support of Allison Pearson. I think that there has been a justified backlash against the suggestion that this was an appropriate use of police time. And I think that the police have been told that this is not good enough, that you can't arrive at a journalist's door and implicitly threaten criminal proceedings for something tweeted over a year ago. It's not acceptable. And the backlash has been extremely welcome. The support from the Telegraph has been extremely welcome. The support amongst some MPs has been extremely welcome. And the hope is now that the police realise that the public are keeping an eye on them and their decision making around these cases. And that hasn't always been the case. I mean, I've been acting with these kinds of allegations for many years now. And we can come and talk about how the criminal law came to have this kind of role and how these cases are now probably more common than ever. But I've sat in police station after police station with people who have been accused of criminal offences because of what they tweet. And the climate really has changed, especially since the passage of the Online Safety Act, which created a new raft of criminal offences which dealt with things that certainly wouldn't have been considered criminal in the past. The Online Safety Act also lowered the threshold for committing a criminal offence online with what you say and or what you tweet. So all the thresholds to getting the police involved in what people say have been lowered, especially with the Online Safety Act. But before that, arguably with the Equalities Act and a change which we can come on to as well within criminal law to recognise more and more crimes as motivated by hate. And that's been a complicated development. Of course, to some extent, it's been a good thing that perhaps we've developed in some ways a more nuanced approach to sentencing where it's motivated by hatred, but that the flip side to it has been quite a worrying passage of decision-making authority to the authorities to decide what is and isn't hate and what isn't hateful. And that, I think, has been quite a worrying development.
Yes. So if we go back then to the origins of this, which I think were about 2013 or 14, and it did seem to come out of pretty much nowhere. So could you just say a few words about how this emerged in the first place then?
Do you mean the policing of speech generally?
Well, particularly the non-crime hate incidents.
Oh, I see. So part of the confusion in Allison Pearson's case was between non-crime hate incidents and crimes. Non-crime hate incidents were a mechanism used by the police to record incidents which they didn't think met the threshold for a crime, but that nonetheless ought to be recorded in case someone committed a crime later on. That was broadly the justification for them. And they started recording all manner of very, very minor incidents as non-crime hate incidents, and effectively were recording, prior to the decision in Harry Miller, which you mentioned earlier, were deciding whether something was hateful or not based on the subjective experience of the person reporting it. In other words, if someone said that an incident was motivated by hatred arising out of a protected characteristic, in other someone's race, sexual orientation, gender, etc., then it would be recorded in that way. And that subjective understanding of what constituted a hate-motivated incident had a prior history, because all of the guidance that was coming out of the Crown Prosecution Service, ironically sometimes under Keir Starmer, who came out in support of Allison Pearson, but was, I think, responsible for a lot of these developments. A lot of the guidance that came out said that these incidents should be treated as hate incidents if the person perceived them to be such. The person who was reporting it perceived them to be motivated by hate. So the classification of a hate crime was, because of policy coming out of the Crown Prosecution Service, because of provisions in the Equality Act, was largely subjective. And that is what led to the decision in Harry Miller, or the challenge in Harry Miller's case, where effectively they said that that was an unlawful way to record these incidents, that you can't classify something as hate influenced because someone subjectively felt that that was the case. But what Harry Miller and his case didn't do is put a stop to recording the incidents entirely. So you now have information received by the Times newspaper suggesting that all manner of very, very minor children aged 9 and 10 in the schoolyard being investigated by the police for using horrible names to one another, all being treated as sort of non-crime hate incidents. It's not quite right to say that the police, once something is treated as a non-crime hate incident, it's no longer being investigated as a crime. I mean, that's suggested in the name. But alongside So the confusion with Allison's case, I think, was that there was a this was that Essex police were never investigating her for a non-crime hate incident. They thought that she'd committed a criminal offence at one stage. Now, of course,
Yes.
that turned out to be rubbish. But she's not the first person to be treated in this way. So we saw David Starkey and Darren Grimes, I think 2 years ago now, investigated for stirring up racial hatred for a broadcast that they produced on Mr. Grimes's YouTube channel. And I'm afraid I'm also acting for a number of different people with far less public profile who are being prosecuted, so taken to court for things that they've said on the YouTube channel or on Twitter. We're also starting to see now the starting of these cases coming in front of juries. So there was an acquittal in a case. I'll look up the details, but we're starting to see the first acquittals coming through of people who have taken cases arising out of the Southport attacks to juries and have been acquitted. So we're seeing the first cases where people in the aftermath of the Southport attacks have tweeted something or said something online, have been arrested, have been prosecuted, and have not pleaded guilty. Because what's important to remember is lots of people have pleaded guilty to crimes arising out of those incidents. And
Yeah.
they're the people that we've heard about the sentences of, so people getting quite harsh sentences. But others have said they're not guilty and have taken their case to trial. And we're now enough time has passed that we're starting to see those cases come in front of juries. And so I now think we're going to see a really interesting period of time where juries test these cases and test this evidence, and juries will be being asked, do you consider this to be stirring up racial hatred? And an important part of stirring up racial hatred is the intent. So often the issue is whether the person speaking intends to stir up racial hatred with what they say. And that can be a very difficult thing to prove. So I think we should all just keep an eye on what's happening in the criminal courts at the moment with respect to these offences, and tracking how the cases that arose out of the Southport incidents end up being tested in front of juries, because I think that's going to be a very interesting moment.
Okay. I mean, it did seem very interesting, just to go back to the Allison Pearson case in particular, that there did seem to be multiple police forces involved, and they, as far as I could tell, seemed to be acting under different bits of legislation, whether it was malicious communications, I think, for one of them, and public order for another, and non-crime hate incidents for another. So it does have the feel of those in authority really grappling around, trying to find something to get someone on, to be blunt about it. So it does have the character of this stuff does seem to be nefarious and almost, I mean, it's overly used word, but quite Orwellian in the sense that it's so subjective as well, that that point that you just made there about proving intent often doesn't seem to come into some of this stuff. So how is it that we've arrived at this? How have they managed to do this?
I'm going to counsel some restraint on the analysis a little bit. It can often seem like prosecutors, the police, and the CPS are acting in an Orwellian way. Sometimes it can certainly feel like that. I think often, though, it is easy to confuse authoritarianism or Orwellian behavior with confusion and disorganization. And quite often, the officers who are asked to deal with this are just as confused about how the law should be applied as everyone else is. So often, I mean, it is the police's job to identify if a criminal offence has been committed, and it is their job to investigate that. And what can quite often happen is that the police might take one view of a piece of communication and think, well, it doesn't necessarily meet the threshold for being grossly offensive, say, which is one offence under the Malicious Communications Act. But it might meet the threshold under a different legislation. Maybe it's harassment. Maybe
Yeah.
it's caused someone harassment, alarm, or distress, in which case they can rely on a piece of legislation from the 19th century, the Protection from Harassment Act. So, or they might now think, well, maybe this is a false piece of communication which has caused someone serious distress, in which case it can be prosecuted under the new Online Safety Act. So what is true is that this does illustrate the wide remit of the law in this area. In other words, there are lots of different potential offences that can now be called upon.
Yes.
Are the police behaving in a way which is trying to nab people and get the right people prosecuted? I think it's more complicated than that, because I think you have to factor in the sheer disorientation, confusion sometimes on behalf of the police and the prosecution about what they should do. It's also true that when the police receive a complaint from a member of the public, they're obliged to investigate it. They have a public sector duty to investigate that crime to the best of their abilities. So they can't just look at a complaint and say, well, that's a load of rubbish, I'm going to ignore it. If they think that there is a possibility that something meets a legal test, then they fall under a duty to investigate it. And an investigation will almost always involve having an interview, because the police say, well, we need to ask the person who sent this message what was in their minds when they did it. What were they thinking? What were they intending? What were they planning? So I do think some of the commentary, even that's come out of this incident, has been slightly overblown. I mean, I've heard some people say that it's now more dangerous to tweet or speak in this country than it is in Russia, because we happen to arrest more people for what we say than the Russians do. Well, that's true, but of course, most of the time, in order to be criminally punished for what you say, you do need to, in this country, you do need to say something quite extreme. However, the flip side to that is that inevitably, where the police have such broad powers and where the police have such skewed priorities, inevitably being spoken to by the police, or the possibility of being spoken to by the police, does have a chilling effect on free speech. Because even if you don't end up before a criminal court, even if you don't end up being prosecuted, the very threat of arrest, the very threat that you will receive a knock on the door from the police, which could result in a 3-month investigation, 2-month investigation, 2-week investigation, is enough to make people think twice about speaking their mind on certain topics. And I think that's the real danger. The danger doesn't come from everyone being locked up for saying something disagreeable. It comes from people feeling the threat of the law around what they say online and elsewhere. And I think that threat is really dangerous.
Yes, and just to go back to that point about the duty to investigate once a complaint's been made, because I suppose one of the things that quite a lot of people say just now is that there's all sorts of burglaries and acts of violence and so on and so forth that rarely are resolved. I mean, and if you speak to people, then anecdotally they would say, well, the police they just never took any notice of the incident happening. So there's a kind of common perception out there, if you like, that the police are not interested in many crimes, but they do seem to be more interested in these sorts of potential crimes, if we want to label it that way. So I suppose one of the things that I find quite difficult is to understand where lies the blame for that, in terms of, is it the politicians and the fact that there are these laws and therefore that places a duty, a certain amount of duties on the police to take these actions, or are the police, like you say, just confused by the plethora of legislation and the lack of clarity in terms of, I suppose, what the role of policing is today, perhaps might be the way of posing it. I mean, kind of where should we allocate some of the blame for this?
Well, I think firstly, policing tweets is very easy. You screenshot what someone has said, you have all the evidence that you need, in theory. Investigating a theft or a burglary is far harder. And the reality is that the police are under-resourced. They they clearly have made a decision about how to allocate resources, and that can involve sometimes burglary being treated as a crime that just can't be solved, you know,
Yeah.
and that's deeply disturbing. I'm also very conscious, having, you know, dealt with the police for the last 14 years, that often they get told by their seniors and by the people who make policy about their police teams that certain things are very, very important, such as, um, you know, by way of example, you won't be able to walk through a police station, a modern police station, without seeing quite a lot of information about protected characteristics, the Equality Act, identity categories, you know, how people identify. This kind of language is everywhere within the police at the moment. They receive a lot of training about it. They receive a lot of guidance about it. And especially around hate crime, they are very conscious of the need to acknowledge the dimension of these kinds of offences. And so I do think that there is a practical side to this, which is policing speech is easy to do. It's easy to get a result in one way or another. I think that the police are far more conscious of these kinds of crimes because of their orientation towards um, social justice issues over the last 10 or 15 years. But then I also think there is a reality, which is that most police officers think this is a bit mad. And, you know, I speak to police officers who deal with these kinds of offences, and often if a police officer's been asked to investigate, say, a claim of harassment, which is often a way of policing what someone has tweeted or sent in an email, that can be an officer from from a domestic violence team looking into those sorts of things. An officer who is normally dealing with protecting vulnerable people is now looking at someone's tweets and someone's emails. And so often I find complete bewilderment that this has landed on a particular officer's desk, and complete confusion and anger that they have to be involved in this sort of stuff. So I think if we wanted to move on to where we could make a difference in how we can change this, I do think there needs to be more firm guidance given to police officers and those in charge of decision making around investigations as to the threshold for opening an investigation into a speech related offence. There should be a very high bar in place before an investigation is even opened into an offence of this kind. Officers should be told that there is a significant presumption in favour of free expression, protected not just by the European Convention, but by our common law right to say what we think. And that threshold should not give way lightly to the criminal law. Because at the moment, officers know a lot about hate crime law, they know a lot about protected characteristics, but they know very little, I think, about the history of free speech and how important it is. And so reversing that by introducing some guidance about when to actually open an investigation would be a very good thing.
And do you think, just to sort of bring this to a conclusion, Luke, do you think that anything will come out of what's gone on in the last week around the Allison Pearson case? And of course, there's also been people like Harry Miller in the news as well, who's around similar sort of hate crime issues, has come to attention because he went in and carried out a citizen's arrest in a police station the other day of one of the officers. Is there anything, do you see hopeful signs of this? Because one of the things that I noticed this week was, well, first of all, there's the Essex police now say there's going to be a formal investigation and a review of this, which you might think, well, yes, that's quite a good thing. But then you think, well, what comes out of these reviews usually? And I did notice that the director of of public prosecutions this week said that he had to look up what a non-crime hate incident was because he wasn't aware of it, which does seem an astonishing lack of awareness of someone in such a senior position not even to know about this stuff. So what are the hopes here in terms of resolving some of this stuff?
Well, I think the more public pressure comes to bear, the better. The fact that there has been such significant outrage over the attendance of two officers at a journalist's home, I think, is a very welcome thing. We've had comments from Keir Starmer saying the police should not be policing tweets. As I've said, I think that's quite rich given his influence on the
Yeah.
law.
But also that his Home Secretary a couple of weeks ago said that she wanted to up the ante in terms of this stuff.
Yeah,
So a bit of
quite.
confusion there.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I think there is the room for real pressure to be applied now. It's part of our conversation in a way which it hasn't been before. These cases have flown under the radar for at least the last decade. I mean, I remember sitting in a police station 6, 7 years ago with someone being investigated for something they tweeted about gender ideology. This stuff is not new. But what could happen and what could come out of this, I think, is some lines being drawn in the sand about when the police get involved in things. I don't think those lines have been there previously. I think the police have proceeded on their merry way to think that they can open investigations without having this kind of scrutiny. But now that scrutiny is on, we have a perhaps unique opportunity to change the way that speech is policed in this country. And it's testament to the efforts of the Free Speech Union. It's testament to the support of the Telegraph newspaper. And it's testament to Allison Pearson and others who have had to live with criminal investigations like this, that we have this opportunity. So I'm hoping that if we all sort of pull together and really apply pressure to the right places, that you could end up making a real difference to what the police think they can get away with. And that is an opportunity to push back the criminal law's involvement in speech-related issues and to reopen the space for free debate. I think that would be a very good thing.
Thanks, Luke. I think that's quite a positive note to end on. And obviously, you've had a busy week, and it's been quite a successful outcome in the particular incident of Allison Pearson. But just to know that you think that some of the conversation around this stuff is starting to make a difference, I think is very positive. And obviously, it's something that we want to pursue again and again at Battle of Ideas Festival, where we've been discussing these things for quite a few years, and probably will have to discuss them for a few years longer. But anything that we can help to do to make a difference as well is obviously going to be welcome. So thanks very much. We very much appreciate it, you making time to speak to us, and hopefully we'll catch you up again soon.
Great to speak to you. Thanks, Alistair.